It's time for some Mets talk. And before we get to the good, some of the winning that has happened over the past few days, I want to start with the bad. And the first one that comes to mind is the Mets GM, Zack Scott, who was arrested on DUI charges Tuesday morning. And Scott was hired as assistant GM in December 2020, but assumed the role of acting general manager in January after Mets fired GM Jared Porter. Now, Zack Scott is placed on leave as of now, and further decisions yet to come. But it is really classic Mets, it feels like, to have something like this. And when you're trying to win games and that is happening, you have something like this happen, really just shows the position the Mets are still kind of in. They really haven't graduated to that kind of franchise level that you always think of with the Yankees. But, Mike, I just want to get your thoughts. You are the Mets fan. What do you think about this recent news?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, just from a human point of view, it's an unfortunate story. I mean, look, thankfully, no one was injured or killed, and Zack Scott just made one of the most heinous decisions a person can possibly make, deciding to get behind the wheel of a car drunk. So that the fact that no one was injured, that's a good thing. But from the baseball point of view, I mean, look, Zack Scott, in my opinion, needed to go regardless of. But prior to this incident happening, he needed to go just because of the way he's performed as general manager of baseball operations. I mean, he's a guy. Look, when you think about the way that this team was put together, the Mets, the ownership bid. I mean, obviously, if we remember back in 2019, Cohen had originally bought the Mets. That fell apart. Then, of course, a few months go by. Then it seems he's back in the bidding process when the sale goes up again. He finally gets his ownership bid wrapped up, finalized in October of 2020, or excuse me, at the end of August. Actually, it feels later than that. But anyway, the point is, by the time that the sale was announced, the deal was finalized. There was a very awkward time for the Mets, and they brought Sandy in there, Sandy Alderson, as a goodwill move. And really, Sandy was the one who, because Sandy had a good relationship with previous owners. He was known around the league. And Cohen, who obviously was somewhat of a controversial figure coming in, he hired Sandy because he knew the Mets and he would be a goodwill move. So Sandy's really the one that put together this team, because Sandy, even before Jared Porter got here, who was before Zack Scott, Sandy, put together the roster. All the players, good and bad, are really Sandy's guys. The Lindor trade was a Sandy move. Signing guys like Aaron Loop, stuff like that, those are Sandy decisions. And then even a move like Taijuan Walker, which happened later, that was a Jared Porter decision. So really, any of the offseason moves, the good ones, let's say, like an Aaron Loop or a Taijuan Walker who's been up and down, you can't give Zack Scott any credit for that. So putting that aside, we have to analyze Zack Scott's performance basically from the start of the season onward, and it's been atrocious. I mean, the team was faltering at the deadline. He knew Jacob deGrom was going to be out, and he did not address the starting pitching at the deadline. The Mets desperately needed starting pitching help if they were going to maintain that first place lead. They didn't, obviously. They went out and got Rich Hill, but that was like a Band-Aid over a dam breaking open. That didn't matter at all. And, I like the Baez move, but they just sat there. They didn't do enough. And I think that all falls on Zack Scott. And to me, he just seemed over his head, because if you remember, before the deadline happened and before all the trades were finalized, there was talk of Zach, saying that it just seemed like he wasn't able to negotiate. Things were saying that the counter offers were ridiculous. It just seemed he was in over his head. So I know I've spewed a lot of information out on our listeners right now, but the bottom line I want to put is this. If there's any positives with this Mets roster, Zack Scott has nothing to do with them. But the negatives, especially the negatives that have happened from the trade deadline onward, I think fall on Zack Scott. So putting even the DUI situation aside, he had to go after this season. And now you throw this in, first, as a personal moral point of view, he's got to go. So I've never been a fan of Zack Scott. If you've ever listened to me on 101, you know that. But to me, this is just another reason why he's got to go.
Yeah, Mike, I mean, I completely agree with a lot of things you said. And one thing you mentioned about being like a moral point of view, I mean, no GM can be doing stuff like this. And obviously, he's got to go now. But just looking at the baseball, like you mentioned, I mean, you didn't really mention a lot about Javier Baez, but his performance has really been lackluster for this Mets team. And he was traded to the Mets, leading the league in MLB strikeouts. So, just that alone was not what the really Mets needed at the time. They did need some power in that lineup, and I guess going on and getting Baez would have helped that. And Lindor was out at the time, so he did fill that shortstop void. But from a statistical point of view, he was not a good player for the Cubs that season. And you do get him on a loan, kind of, but now the question is going to be re-signing him, and that's a big question mark. But the Baez move has not really helped you a lot. And you wanted a pitcher. You should have gotten a pitcher because you don't have DeGrom there, and you're really relying on Taijuan Walker to stay how he was pitching. And Marcus Stroman was still that guy, but he's not really an ace for a team. And like a team like the Toronto Blue Jays, they went out to get their guy, Jose Barrios. The Mets really did not pursue him heavy enough, or any pitchers on the market. So that really left them with, not a lot to play with when you only get Javier Baez. And a lot of that points to the moves in the general manager office. So I think there's a lot of things there that has not gone right with this Mets team. And you could point a lot of that to the general manager in Zack Scott.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would even say, in terms of Baez, I totally get what you're saying. That was what some of my initial hesitation with, the trade was that I didn't want a guy who was going to get up there and strike out half the time. That being said, and we'll get into the thumbs down thing in a second, because obviously Baez was at the front of that as well. The thing is, I kind of, even though I didn't agree with the move initially, once he got here, I knew what we were getting. We were going to get a guy, like you said, who strikes out a lot. But when he connects solidly. He can hit the ball over the fence. He can hit it far into the second deck. Even, some of the furthest home runs I've seen, aside from Alonso, are off the bat of Javier Baez. So I like the power. He's obviously great defensively. He is a magician when it comes to just kind of running the bases. And it's so, in terms of the Baez move itself, I've actually learned to kind of like it somewhat. It wasn't enough. And, to me, the issue was Baez was good. It was fine, in my opinion. And even though I was initially hesitant, I ended up liking the move just fine. But it just wasn't enough. And and you mentioned that we both mentioned the pitching. That was very frustrating to me. I would also throw out bullpen help. I mean, this team has relied on the bullpen heavily this season. Obviously, guys like Aaron Loop, even Diaz, who I know he's had his moments at times this season, but have been very solid. But Trevor May has been somewhat disappointing. Familia, I don't trust him at all. Miguel Castro started off strong, but has not pitched well down the stretch. You knew at the deadline as well that if you were going to be a playoff team, you needed some bullpen help, and he didn't get that either. Now, they just claimed Brad Hand off of waivers. He was obviously pitching well for the Nats, not so well for Toronto. The Mets actually pursued Hand in the offseason, and now they finally get him. I guess we'll see what happens now. They finally got their guy, so to say. But look, I think Zack Scott, he just didn't do enough at the deadline. He's just not the right guy for the job. I think he needs to go. And I think in a larger point, I mentioned before, Sandy is the guy that really put this roster together. And for that reason, also Sandy needs to go, because Sandy, I understand there's been a couple of good guys this year, Aaron Loop being one of them, I think has been a great signing. I think Walker, aside from some of the disappointing games in the second half, I think he's just kind of tired coming off a shortened season. I think that's been a solid move. But Lindor, I mean, let's call it like it is. I like the trade at the time, but it's been a bust, and that was on Sandy. Moves like James McCann, that did not work out well at all. It's just Sandy is just proven that he's not in touch. He's out. And also, we got to give Sandy heat for being the guy that hired Jared Porter, hired Zack Scott. He also heavily pursued Trevor Bauer. So that's three cases of a guy. Three examples of guys that have very questionable character history, and Sandy did not do his homework on them. Does that make Sandy as bad as those guys? No, it doesn't. But it really shows that Sandy is just not well equipped for the position. I think more than likely, I think Steve Cohen, I think this was a big transition year for the Mets. I think as a Met fan, we expected some big new things with this new ownership of Steve Cohen. I think some good things have happened. I think we've shown a willingness, a desire to win. We've shown a willingness to go out and make moves. I think that's great. But I think as we opened up kind of the catacombs of Citi Field after the Wilpon sold, and all these skeletons that come out of the closet of, bad guys, harassment, a culture of harassment, I think it was going to take some time for Steve Cohen, and he's shown a willingness to change the culture. He's did an investigation. I think these guys who are not good guys are all going to be gone by season's end. Zack Scott's also on leave right now because of the DUI. I think it's likely he doesn't come back for the rest of the season. So the point is this. I think Scott will be gone. I think Sandy's going to be gone. I think more than likely, unless he has a great run in the playoffs or something, Rojas will be gone. And then with that, Steve can bring in some guys who can breathe in some fresher light into this, or fresher air into this organization, help turn things around, help maximize players. And he can bring in guys who are just more in touch, who can build a better roster. And, it's been frustrating at times, but this is just a process. And when you have a team that was as poorly run as the Mets were, under the Wilpons for 20 years when they were the sole owners, essentially, we can't be surprised when all these secrets finally start spilling out, because it's disturbing. It's upsetting that my team has this culture in place, but I can only hope that going forward that these guys are no longer around.